Welcome to Calvary Chapel University and our study in the book of Romans. We decided to do these lectures on YouTube instead of the students. Certain students had difficulty in uploading or downloading our lectures due to the size of the file. So we're going to have to go fast because the YouTube videos don't allow for hour-long lectures, so to speak. So let's fire away. I'm going to begin by giving you some background information about the book of Romans: name, author, date, and what was going on and what the various theories are behind the church at Rome. So the name of the letter is named for its recipients, the church in Rome. Some say churches, as in plural. As far as the author and date, remember Paul was converted around AD 35. So that would only be some 2-3 years after the ascension of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. Paul is the undisputed author of the epistle to the Romans. He opens up the letter declaring himself to be the author. He says in verse 1 of chapter 1, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle. Moreover, the style and language, the verbiage of Romans is very similar to Galatians and 1 Corinthians, the other two universally accepted epistles written by Paul. So we have other clues as far as the authorship of Paul. Several clues. The date of the writing of Romans may be somewhat accurately determined. Evidence in the letters to the church in Corinth, the book of Acts, and Romans itself indicates that Paul wrote Romans from Corinth, the city of Corinth, during his third missionary journey. In both Corinthian letters, Paul says that a collection was being taken up for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. You can check 1 Corinthians 16, the first 3 verses, and 2 Corinthians chapter 8 through 9, verse 1. But by the time Paul wrote Romans, this collection had been completed already, and Paul was planning on leaving for Jerusalem to deliver it. You have that in Romans 15, verses 22 through 29. But there was a deaconess, a woman by the name of Phoebe, who was to deliver the letter to Rome, presumably leaving at the same time as Paul did. But if you recall, there was a Jewish plot against Paul that forced him to leave Corinth prematurely, walking through Macedonia instead of taking a ship and sail directly from Corinth. So Paul ended up boarding a ship headed for Jerusalem from Philippi the next spring. Paul's stay in Corinth has been dated to have ended in the fall of AD 57. So with a relative amount of certainty, the Epistle of the Romans may be dated to the early fall of AD 57. So we have summary so far. We have Paul's conversion in AD 35, only some 3 years after the ascension of Christ. His desire to visit Rome was around 54 AD. Then he writes Romans in 57. Finally, he's imprisoned in 60 AD, including sharing a prison cell with Peter prior to being crucified upside down, according to tradition. And of course, in time, Paul lost his head in Rome. If you haven't been to Jerusalem or Rome, I couldn't stress anymore for you to actually double up on a trip. Go to Jerusalem, do the tour there, and then fly from Israel into Rome. That distance is minimal, and it's not that expensive to do it. And I tell you, when you're in the prison cell that Peter and Paul shared, it adds so much authenticity to the scriptures, and just the faith comes alive. And I've been in that prison cell, and there's another prison cell in Caesarea Maritima at the Mediterranean in Israel that you can see as well and visit. As far as the audience, Paul addresses the letter to all who are in Rome, those that are beloved of God, called to be saints. That's in verse 7 of chapter 1. At the same time of the writing of this letter, Paul had not yet visited Rome. In fact, it isn't known for sure how the Roman church was started, and this is where we must pay attention. Some have postulated that it was a new Jewish converts that returned from Jerusalem after Pentecost. And these Jewish believers, after Peter preached in Jerusalem, they organized the first community of believers in Rome. So that view is that the early church in Rome that Paul was addressing was predominantly Jewish. It is thought that there were as many as 50,000 Jews living in Rome at the time. What is clear from the contents of the epistle is that the Roman believers were in need of an almost systematic theological treatise, a systematic theology, salvation, sanctification, and unity within the body of the Roman believers. So apparently, these believers had embraced faith in Jesus, most likely at Pentecost in Jerusalem. Then they returned to Rome, and Paul's chief aim was to establish them in the faith. Like Jude says, I think it's Jude 7, contend earnestly for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. 1 Peter 3:15, be ready always to give an apologia, an answer, a reasonable case for the hope that lies within you with meekness and respect. So, number one, professed faith in Jesus. Number two, grounding the believers. That seems to be what Paul is aiming at. The composition of the Roman church is a subject of debate. Some argue that the church was largely Gentile, and I go with that view following a certain persecution. So keep that in mind. Some people say that the majority was Jewish, and I think here's how we can solve it. Let's see, in AD 49, Emperor Claudius, he expelled the Jews from Rome. They were thrown out of Rome. One historian says that it was due to strife and bickering over someone called Christus, which is thought to be Christ. So if the early Jewish believers, after Pentecost, hearing Peter's preaching, and thousands came to faith, if you recall in the book of Acts, upon returning to Rome, these believers would have been predominantly Jewish. But then in AD 49, when Claudius kicked them out of Rome, maybe there was just a handful or a remnant of Gentile believers there. After the persecution sort of came to rest, Jews were allowed to come back in. And it seems to me that when the Jews were allowed to come back into Rome, now you have that mixture of a Gentile body and a Jewish body. In fact, after Claudius's persecution in AD 49, it could be that when the Jews returned into Rome, maybe they were in the minority. That's possible as well. So it would have left, the act of expelling the Jews would have left the Roman church mainly Gentile, whatever was left of it. And then after Claudius's death in 54, persecution was in 49, and then he died in 54. Again, Jews were allowed back into the city. So based on one of Paul's themes in Romans, we see the word unity. It has been surmised that this upheaval led to conflict between Gentile and Jewish elements in the Roman church. So the fact that there's unity within the church at Rome, or that's what Paul is stressing in this letter, we know most definitely that there was a mixture between Jew and Gentile. So that's it on that note. As far as the message and occasion, as mentioned before, Paul included several messages in Romans. I mentioned salvation, sanctification, and unity. Paul stresses the, number one, universality of human sin. All men have sinned, fallen short to the glory of God, Romans 3:23. He stresses the need for and a way to obtain salvation. That's number two. And three, the statuses of the believer before God. And then finally, the need for harmony within the community itself. And we're going to have to take a little break here due to the timing of the YouTube videos. So this is Introduction Part 1. Stay tuned.